two models of civilization, Egypt and Mesopotamia. What we're going to be doing today is just taking a quick look at some of the most significant characteristics and differences between the ancient civilizations of Egypt and Mesopotamia, or the Sumerian civilization at this early point in time. And what these civilizations have in common, as do all of the other civilizations that are this early, such as, for example, Harappa, is that it's built around irrigation. These are societies that, in order to feed their population, in order to deal with environmental change, they need to be able to have an irrigation system. And it has to be more than just an individual thing. They can't farm just off of the water that comes from the sky, or that they can manipulate themselves within their family. And in order to have this kind of big irrigation system, they have to fulfill these requirements. They have to have workers who can work on it. They have to have people setting a plan to keep it maintained. They have to build it. And they also have to agree on how the water that gets produced is going to be distributed. All of that requires someone to do the organizing, usually. And more than that, it means that you can produce more. Producing more means you can have a denser population. Having that denser population, you can further build your system that you're building up, and you need more labor, and you can sort of see how this all becomes a reinforcing situation. All of this is dependent on having a river to provide you with the water you need and to fertilize the soil. And that's why all of these really early civilizations we talk about are civilizations built around rivers. And that's true in Mesopotamia, it's true in Egypt with the Nile, it's true also in the Indus Valley, and of course it's true in northern China with the Shang. It's always built around having that river there to make it possible. We're going to start by talking about Mesopotamia first. When we describe Mesopotamia as the land of two rivers, is the term we use, and that's because it is literally a land of two rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates. One thing also to keep in mind is that it's a land of two rivers that are not as dependable. The floods don't always come on regular schedules. There are horrible storms. There are occasions when they actually shift their course. It's a much more dangerous world that you face in that case. And that sort of, historians tend to say, that influenced the way the Mesopotamians looked at the world. They lived in a world that was often dangerous and undependable, and so they tended to expect that and sort of see that as how the universe worked. When we're talking about Mesopotamia, we're talking, at least to start with, about city-states. And actually, it's going to continue to be, at its core, a land of cities. And each city, of course, would be surrounded by small villages that are beholden to that city, that send their crops into there, their produce into there, that are, pay their taxes there, contribute their labor there, and in exchange, hopefully, are protected, given services from the city as well. But at its heart, it's individual cities that are competing with each other, and that's why we call them city-states. And in fact, they're quite commonly, in this case, Mesopotamian city-states to go to war with each other. And of course, later on, what that's going to develop into is a situation where they're going to start building empires. So one city-state will go ahead and conquer and take over a series of other city-states to build up their first empires. Because they live in a world of danger, these are always walled cities. And from our point of view, if you were going to walk into one of those Mesopotamian cities, it probably would be a pretty massive shock to your system. This isn't a world without sewers. This is a world where you dump garbage at unoccupied lots. There seems to be evidence that in some cases corpses were dumped in lots, but that may have actually come from a time period where these cities were breaking down, where people lived very closely, densely populated together. It's also one thing about cities in Mesopotamia and most ancient cities, medieval cities, that's different from the way we're accustomed to thinking about it. We tend to think of the rich people living outside of the city, on the outskirts and the suburbs, and the poor people living in the center. Pretty much the opposite in ancient cities. The outskirts, that's where all the nasty stuff was, and that's like people who are making leather, and one of the ways you tan leather is well, basically you use waste. And, you know, all the various, and the garbage and all the various unpleasant stuff, it's all out there on the outskirts. And of course, also, that's the people who have to travel the furthest to get to the palace, to get to the temples, to get all the things at the center. So that's where the poor people are, in that unpleasant area. If you're at the top of society, if you're the king, if you're the priest, if you're the gods in their temples, those are all at the center of the city in this period. Of course, at the base of this system is the peasants. They're the overwhelming majority of the population. Overwhelming, you know, 90 so or more percent of the population, those are the peasants. They're the huge bulk of people. They're the ones who also pay the bulk of the taxes. They grow the grain to keep everybody fed. And they live, on the whole, fairly hard lives. For the most part, peasants are free citizens. In the case of Mesopotamia, there's a bit of an exception where the temples have slaves that are taken as prisoners of war often and then are given to them by the king. After victories in war, he gives them the prisoners of the war. They take them as slaves and use them to work on the large estates that some of the temples owned. But for the most part, peasants are free. They're free citizens. There are a few slaves around, but those are mostly used as domestic servants. You become a slave if you get into debt. You become a slave if you're a prisoner of war. It's not based on any kind of racial or ethnic division in this period of time. So there you've got the peasants. They're the ones who make it all work. They're the ones who get the least amount out of it. And actually, just to give you a sense of that, if you actually look at the bones, the skeletons left behind by these people, often the women will have, their bones will actually be deformed because of all the time they spent grinding grain in order to turn it into food for people to eat. Of course, there was another thing that peasants did with grain, and it's historically been one of the best ways to store grain, which was they made beer out of it. And that was clearly seen as one of the riches of civilization. Very common. Literacy. That's one of the characteristics of these civilizations. And all of them, we're going to talk about a whole bunch of urban civilizations over this semester. All of them have some way of keeping records. Now, it's not always a written language. The Inca, for example, in the Andes Mountains in what we'd call South America, actually had a record system that was based on, basically a very complicated symbolic system of using knots. But in general, if you're going to have an urban civilization, you have to have some kind of way of keeping records. And in fact, the earliest use of what becomes writing we know about in Mesopotamia, it's essentially bookkeeping. It's people taking in and making marks on a clay tablet on which, on clay tablets they have a record of you paid this amount of grain last year, or I gave you 2 sheep, you owe me a cow, or things like that. It's basically bookkeeping. And then over time it develops into a much more complicated system. Using that system of literacy was seen as a highly specialized skill, a difficult skill. It's something you had to study for years to get, to be able to do. And because of that also, not uncommonly, scribes, that's the name for people who could write. And so you would have, if you were, let's say, the king, you would have scribes who worked for you to do your writing for you. But they're not uncommonly also, they end up becoming administrators at various levels for the temples and for the government and for the king. And that's because they're the ones who can keep the records, and therefore they're the ones who can organize the projects and things like that. There's another use of literacy that was very important to Mesopotamians, and for thousands of years, the priests in the cities actually kept astronomical records of the stars and what was going up in the stars and the moon and the sun above. And that's because, from their point of view, what was going in the heavens would reflect the movements and choices of the gods. And so if you could see the patterns, if you could learn about it, then maybe you could predict how the gods were going to react, what they were going to do, and you could make better decisions for the city. And so astronomical record keeping was really important to them, and they had records that went on for huge amounts of time. Mesopotamian gods. And what you're looking at there is a sculpture actually showing a male worshiper. He's not a god, he's someone who's worshiping the gods. He's made as a little statue. And just to get a sense, that's about 5,000 years old. So that's a very old piece of pottery. Gods for Mesopotamians, like they did in a lot of ancient civilizations, are based on natural forces, okay? So they're things like the river, or they're more general forces like storms, or the sky, or the water, those kinds of natural forces. And then as mythology develops, and as people's thinking about these gods develops, they begin to be seen as having very complicated lives like human beings, in the sense that they have wives, they have children, they have husbands, they get angry, they get killed, they do all the kinds of things that human beings do. At the same time, they're immensely powerful, and the Mesopotamians believe that you can never really predict or control them. And so just as a storm could wipe out your crop, that could be the actions of the gods. Humans, according to Mesopotamian mythology, were created to serve the gods. Basically, the gods got together, they were fighting over which of them was going to have to do the work, and so they end up creating human beings in order to do the work for them. So humans are seen as being useful for the gods, and so it's important that human beings keep up their end of the bargain by giving tribute to the temples, by looking after the gods in the temples, providing with all the things they might need. But it's also true that you can't predict what the gods might get up to. And in fact, one of the myths of Mesopotamia goes that some time back, human beings had been making so much noise that it prevented the gods from sleeping. And so they sent a flood. The flood the goal was to wipe out all the people. But one of the gods took pity on them. He told one virtuous man and his family how to survive. And there's versions of this myth that you may be familiar with that come from the same part of the world. But in this case, what they were facing destruction for wasn't because they were sinful people. It wasn't because the people were immoral. It's basically because they were inconvenient and irritating to the gods. And I think that maybe sort of summarizes the fear of why Mesopotamians were quite so wary of their gods and what they might get up to. Priests. Priests play an important role in these civilizations. One of the most important things priests do is priests connect the city to the gods. Okay, so they're the ones who you give the offerings to for them to offer up to the gods. They perform the rituals that please the gods. They keep records of the actions of the natural world. One of the most important was astronomy, but there's also a variety of other things, such as the flight of birds. Certain kinds of sacrifices can be used for divination, that are ways of trying to understand and see the natural world around you, and use that as a way to predict what the gods are going to do, and thus what's going to happen in the future. And we talk about these things today, and if I say astronomy, we think science, and if I say astrology, we think, pop pseudoscience. And that's a real major distinction for us today. For the Mesopotamians and for people for a very long time, they wouldn't see a distinction there. They would say you want to get as accurate of information as possible about the natural world and the stars and what's happening out there, because that's your best chance of understanding what's going on and influencing what's going on. But their hope of doing that included things that we would today describe as being sort of magical thinking. So priests were in charge of keeping records of those kinds of things. They're in charge of caring for the gods. In the case of Mesopotamia, the practice would be is that there were these statues that sort of embodied the gods in the temples. And those gods would have their clothes changed for the seasons. They would be left meals and offerings. They would then, if it was when it got to be summer, they would leave town and go on a big visit out to their large estate in the country where it was cooler and more pleasant. For the summertime, they would go on visits to gods at other temples. And so there was this real sense that by caring for these statues, which sort of embodied the gods, that you were therefore pleasing and caring for the gods themselves. And once again, you want to keep those gods happy with you. And also, as part of all of this, they advised the king. Kings had a lot of jobs. And as time goes on, they become, of course, sort of the leaders of the societies. In Mesopotamia, one of the important things kings do is they fight wars. And that's important because of the constant competition between the different cities. They collect taxes and bring money in. And as part of that, by the way, they also spend that money. And that's sort of part of what makes this whole cycle work. It's a different kind of concept of how an economy would work than you're probably accustomed to thinking of. But in this case, one of the things that makes resources get shared out among society is everything comes into the king, or a great deal of it all comes into the king and also the temples. But then the king gives it away. So he goes to his favorite nobles, and because they've served him so well, he gives them gifts. And they take those gifts, and they take those gifts and spend the money, and part of it they give away. So part of the way you show how important you are is because you can give stuff away. And so that's one of the important ways that resources get redistributed through the economy. So they spend resources and they give stuff away. That's an important thing. They make sure that the gods are served and taken care of. And over time, they begin to build empires. Okay. One more thing that's important in these civilizations, and Mesopotamia is one of the ones who maybe developed this more than some of the others, long-distance trade. And basically, that means it's not just any kind of trading or bartering that might go on within the city. It means exchanging gifts over very long distances. And that's sort of one distinction, by the way, that you see. In Egypt, long-distance trade is almost exclusively something that the government does. It takes the format of the king of Egypt will send gifts to another king or queen. They will send gifts back. It's seen as a diplomatic exchange. We sort of look at that and we think, oh, they're engaging in trade, because they have stuff that the other people don't have and they've exchanged it. But the way it would be thought about by the Egyptian royalty and the royalty of the other countries often would be as gift giving between the two. Mesopotamia has something that looks a lot closer to what we would think of as trade, in that there are merchants who their career is to engage in long-distance trade. It's often a family business, and they actually invest in it, and they take the risks, and they profit or they fail as the cause of it. We actually know a little bit about this in Mesopotamia because the merchants wrote letters, and so they found some of these letters and tells us a little bit about how it worked. One thing to keep in mind, by the way, is these guys had to travel very long distances, and it wasn't easy to do. You either traveled by foot, you maybe traveled with donkeys, or if you were really lucky, you traveled along the river, because that's the easiest way to do it. As time goes on, they begin to travel by boats, so they can travel on the Mediterranean, though even then, they're not going to get out of sight of shore, because if they do that, they have no idea and no way to tell where they are exactly. So I say that they can travel on the open seas. Yes and no. They're traveling on the sea. They're not getting very far from shore. It's not safe to do that. And just to put that in a little context, You could travel if you were trying to get your goods from Mesopotamia and Egypt or Egypt or something like that. You're talking about over like 800 miles or more. And you're talking about a trip that you take 15, 17, 18 miles a day. And I won't try to do the math, but you get the sense that that could be a very, very long excursion. Egypt. A lot of the same kinds of things we see in Mesopotamia, we see in Egypt as well. It's built on irrigation. You have you have peasants supporting at the bottom. You have leaders at the top. You have powerful priests in the temples, but there's some differences as well. One thing to always keep in mind when we talk about Egypt is we're talking about a land that's in between. That at the top, Egypt connects with the Mediterranean Sea and the lands around the Mediterranean. At the bottom, Egypt connects with sub-Saharan Africa, so Africa below the Saharan Desert. And really, if you were going to travel from North Africa to sub-Saharan Africa for a very long period of time, the Nile River is one of the very few ways that you can actually do that, is by traveling down the Nile River. That feeds into a question that some people try to get into a lot of fights about, which was how African was Egypt? I don't really think it's a very useful question. Egypt was a multiracial society by our kinds of terms. In other words, you had people who came from what we would, who came up from sub-Saharan Africa. You had people who were travelers coming from the Mediterranean, but you also had a wide range of people who lived in Egypt itself. It's one of the more diverse societies historically, and that's because it does play this middle role. It's also distinctive, by the way, because Egypt remains Egypt. If you were to go to somebody in Mesopotamia, the time period we're talking about, they would know what Egypt was. But it's also interesting to me that if you went a few thousand years later and you talked to a Roman, they would know what Egypt was. And if you went a few thousand years after that, now, and you ask us where Egypt is, we'll tell you where Egypt is as well. So for a good portion of that time, Egypt's conquered by someone else. But still, Egypt keeps, I guess I would say, a sense of its own integrity or uniqueness that I think is pretty rare historically. At the heart, of course, are peasants and villages. And Egypt had fewer slaves even than Mesopotamia. They didn't have that large use of slaves on the estates of the temples that Mesopotamia did. And so the bulk of the land was the peasants living in villages. One thing that's a little bit different, though, is it's not organized about the cities. We'll talk more about it in a moment about that. Once again, peasants, they provide the grain, they provide the taxes, they also provide the labor. If there's a major building project and it's off-season, in other words, it's during the time of flood, so you can't actually farm, part of what they do as sort of their taxes is what they call corvée labor. Basically, it means they go out and they do the building projects. And that happens in Mesopotamia as well, but of course we know that there's some very famous building projects that were going on in the case of Egypt. The pyramids and the massive tombs went with that. And so that was another thing they did as well. By the way, we also have some records from Egyptian peasants and their villages. And it also looks like apparently one of the things Egyptian peasants did is they sued each other a lot over, who stole what or who was cheating someone in the will. And so I guess human nature really hasn't changed all that much. The description of the life of the peasant we have here, I'm going to read it to you. It's from the Satire on the Trades. And like always in these lectures, if you're seeing this sort of box off here to the side, that means it's a primary source I want you to look at. I'm not expecting you to copy it down. And one thing to keep in mind as you're going to listen to this, it's a poem that scribe students were taught when they were in school trying to learn writing. This is one of the things they would be taught to write as an example. And so part of the subtext of this, of course, is you should be grateful to be in school. You should be glad to be doing it. Look at how miserable everyone else is. And if you don't get happier about it, we're going to beat you. But it still probably does have some points about actual peasant life. The farmer, he complains incessantly, his cry more raucous than the ravens. His fingers go about their duties through all the raging of the storm. Wearied beyond reward down in the marshes, he becomes a living wreck. His storehouse is depleted by the lions. He reaches home exhausted, and the taxman cuts him down. Which is true to a certain extent for peasants, historically. Though, from what we can tell, Egypt was probably one of the better and more fertile places to live. Big difference between Mesopotamia and Egypt. We talked about Mesopotamia being built around the city-states. Egypt's very different. Egypt operates as a kingdom. They build cities, but the cities come later, and they're built basically as administrative centers. So, whereas in the case of Mesopotamia, you start with the cities and then you build empires, Egypt always had a kingdom. And then the cities, they build the cities as they need them to get the business of the kingdom done. One other distinctive thing about Egypt historically is that it's desert. If you go more than a few miles off basically from the river. And so what Egyptian society is it's basically this strip of land on either side of the Nile River that ties it together. And so, of course, transportation, things like that, most of that was built around the Nile and the Nile River. Kings. They had some of the same responsibilities in Mesopotamia in the sense that, once again, warfare is part of their duties. I talked a little bit about how trade was usually seen as a royal responsibility in Egypt, gift giving between royalty. And there was a lot, we have records of a fair amount of that being done. Kings in Mesopotamia had some of this responsibility of connecting humans with the gods, keeping them happy, right? We talked about giving them gifts to the gods, giving part of the spoils from the war, and all that would be true in Egypt as well. But there's a more literal sense to it. The king was seen as the son of a god. And in fact, when he died, all the things that they did to the body to preserve them, the mummies, which were actually counterproductive, it looks like, but all the things they thought would preserve the body, what they're doing is they're preserving him to be a god. And so the king, while he is king, is not a god, but he's the son of a god, and he's a future god. And so he's sort of a link between human beings and the divine. Another thing that's distinctive is there's a belief for the Egyptians that the king has a moral responsibility. His job is to maintain mat, which is a sense of justice and order in the kingdom. And that is part of his duty. It's not just to defend the kingdom. It's not just to keep the kingdom together. He's also supposed to make sure that justice is through all the land. Now, practical terms, if you're a peasant, your life really doesn't intersect with the king except for in paying taxes and working on his pyramid. But at least in theory, there's this concept that that's part of what the king does. And so there'd be various folk stories about things like the peasant who's been wronged and somehow comes to the attention of the king and his wrongs are righted. And so even if they don't live up to it, there is a sense that there should be some kind of moral basis for the way that government functions. The pyramids. The pyramids take a huge amount of resources. We talked about corvée labor, the having to do work as part of your taxes. And so that's part of what workers did. They did get fed and paid, and it actually wasn't necessarily such a bad thing for them, but it was a demand on their lives. When they're not farming, they're supposed to be doing these kinds of major building projects. The pyramids also sucked in the energies of a lot of scribes who managed these projects, and also craftsmen. If you've ever seen pictures of the things that are found in these tombs, a lot of what they do is this amazing works of art that were then put in these tombs. Now, looking at it, you look at that and you think, this is no way to run an economy. You shouldn't be producing all of this wealth, all of these resources, sticking them in the tombs, and then locking the tombs away. And it all started making much more sense to me when I learned that actually, pretty much from the moment you try to seal up your pyramid, people are breaking into it. And in fact, that's one of the reasons why there's so few of the remains to be found in these actual pyramids. That's because people have been breaking into them pretty much from the day they were built. And so, in a sense, even if it's not what the king intends, his theory is that all these wonderful goods are going to go into his pyramid so he can take them with him into the next world. They're actually getting stolen out and being brought back into the economy in that method. So not so much of it's being lost in that way. Another sort of detail which I find always sort of amazing is pretty much from the beginning as well, there's tourism. I mean, obviously not the kinds of people we have today, but there are people who are making tourist visits to see the pyramids, all the way back in the time when they were actually new. Life after death. This is another distinction. It's not really clear what happens after death for the Mesopotamians, but there's a general implication that probably what happens is you become ghosts, which means that you wander cold and hungry, basically cut off from the world. And that's why it would be important for you people to leave offerings out for their dead relatives, because otherwise they're going to be totally alone and deserted, and they can become very nasty and dangerous. It's not clear that that's necessarily what happens, but it sort of seems to be the way it looks in a lot of myths. Egypt, on the other hand, has some really clear ideas about what happens after death, and it becomes a sort of central theme for them. And one place where it starts is the concept that for them, the gods symbolize rebirth and renewal. And once again, we go back to the rivers. The Nile River follows a pattern. It floods every year, or at least it did before modern stuff. But basically, historically, it flooded every year. It brought new fertile soil for farming, and you could depend on it. And that made that Egypt was one of the richer places to grow food and one of the more dependable and safer places to grow food. And that's going to continue, by the way. One of the things that long term is going to make Egypt such a valuable place and also such a target for conquest is Egypt is sort of one of the major sources of grain in the ancient world around the Mediterranean at various points in time. So that's why the Romans want it. That's why the Ottomans want it, other people as well. Excuse me. Excuse me. Okay. So you have this view, this idea of that the world is much more dependable. And if you look at the stories about the gods and goddesses of Egypt, they tend to also symbolize renewal, rebirth. There's a whole series of myths in which, I'm not going to get into the details, but basically in which things happen and then the god is reborn, brought back to them. So very early on, there's this concept that the king, at least, because remember, if the king becomes a god, the king will go on to this land after death. And so he will go, and that's why he needs to have all these possessions in his tomb, so he can take them with him to his life after death. And he also, initially, the idea is that he can bring his followers along. And so people would be buried next to the king or be allowed to be buried in there, or would kill themselves to go with the king into the next world. However, as time went on, it shifts. So it becomes not just that it's the king that can go, it's anyone who can show that they have lived their life how they should have. And that is the absolutely key thing. And there's this ritual that is supposed to happen after death, which symbolizes it, which you're seeing in that picture down there below. What it comes down to is this, is the way that you act in your life. If you do things that are wrong, if you steal from orphans and widows, if you don't make the proper offerings to the gods, if you disrespect the king, If you do a whole wide variety of things that are wrong, the things that are wrong, as you do them, they weigh your heart down. So sort of think about it as if the wrong that you do sort of accumulates in you, adhering to you, and over your life. You ever heard the phrase heavy with sin? Somewhat like that. So what happens after death is that symbolically this happens. The god Anubis comes to you and he takes you, and then he takes out your heart and he puts it on a scale, and on the other side is the feather of justice, and your heart gets weighed. And if you've lived a good life and you haven't committed those things that are going to weigh your heart down, your heart is light and you go on. And if you've lived a bad life and your heart is heavy with the sins of your actions, then it's discarded and you're thrown into, basically you're thrown into the pit. So it's a sense that not just that the gods are there, not just that the gods are a more nurturing gods, it's that the gods actually care about how you act in your life, and that there is some kind of moral guiding principle that should be involved in it, and that's part of what the gods care about. By the way, I'm not saying that Mesopotamians did not have a sense of morals or laws or beliefs about what's right and wrong. It's just that they didn't really think the gods were all that concerned about it. Egyptians say, no, the gods actually do care. They care if you do the right thing, and that's going to determine what happens to you after death. So, got a series of contrasts here. You've got Egypt, we had kingdoms. We had a kingdom, one kingdom. Mesopotamia, we had the city-states, and eventually empires. You've got, on the side of Egypt, belief in a kind afterlife, a bleak afterlife for the Mesopotamians. You can see that this doesn't exactly link up, but you get the point. For Egypt, the king represents the gods on earth, not really the same amounts for the Mesopotamians. Mesopotamia has an independent merchant class and a stronger investment in long-distance trade. And of course, with Egypt, keep in mind that Egypt is a linking place between sub-Saharan Africa and the Mediterranean, which a lot of the civilizations we're going to be talking about are focused under.